There are names that history tries to forget, names that powerful men spent fortunes to erase from public memory. Andres O'Donnell is one of those names. In the early 1900s, deep in the Amazon rainforest, where the Putumayo River winds through dense jungle, this young man of Irish-Peruvian descent became part of one of the most horrific genocides of the 20th century. He was just 17 when he first arrived at the rubber stations. By the time he disappeared without a trace in New York around 1910, he had managed one of the largest slave plantations in the Amazon, where tens of thousands of indigenous people were tortured, enslaved, and murdered for rubber. This is the story they tried to bury. The Amazon basin at the turn of the 20th century was a place where fortunes bloomed like exotic flowers and died just as quickly. The rubber boom had transformed sleepy river towns into bustling ports, turned adventurers into millionaires, and indigenous peoples into slaves. It was into this world that Andres O'Donnell arrived, though exactly when and from where remains somewhat unclear. What we do know is that between 1903 and 1910, he managed the Entre Rios station for the Peruvian Amazon Company, one of the most important outposts in the vast network, controlled by the notorious rubber baron Julio Cesar Arana. The Peruvian Amazon Company, also known as the Anglo-Peruvian Amazon Rubber Company, operated in a region that straddled the borders of Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. The Putumayo River Basin, where O'Donnell worked, was particularly rich in wild rubber trees. But extracting that rubber required labor, and in the lawless expanses of the Amazon, that labor came from the indigenous populations, the Witoto, Bora, Okena, and Andok peoples who had lived in these forests for countless generations. To understand O'Donnell's story, you have to understand the system he was part of. The rubber stations weren't just collection points, they were instruments of terror. Each station chief received commissions based on the amount of rubber collected, creating an incentive structure that rewarded brutality. The more rubber you extracted, the more money you made. And the only way to extract more rubber was to push the indigenous workers beyond human endurance. O'Donnell's station at Entre Rios sat along the river routes that connected the interior rubber-producing areas with La Chorrera, the main agency headquarters. From there, rubber would be shipped downriver to Iquitos and eventually to the markets of Europe and North America, where it would be transformed into bicycle tires, rain boots, and the 1,000 other products that the industrial age demanded. The CIPO at Entre Rios was particularly cruel. Unlike simpler stocks that might hold a person's head and hands, this device had 24 holes that could trap multiple limbs simultaneously. Men, women, and children would be locked into these positions for days or weeks. Some died there, from starvation, from their wounds, from the sheer agony of being held in impossible positions. Roger Casement, the British consul who would later investigate these crimes, noted that whole families were sometimes imprisoned together, parents dying while their children watched. But the CIPO was just one tool in O'Donnell's arsenal of control. The indigenous workers at Entre Rios were required to bring in massive amounts of rubber during what were called fabricos, or collection periods. O'Donnell claimed to Casement that he only required 2 fabricos per year, each bringing in about 16,000 kilograms of rubber. But Frederick Bishop, a Barbadian who worked at the station, revealed the truth. The actual amount was closer to 24,000 kilograms per collection period. Think about what that meant for the workers. Each indigenous person would have to tap dozens of rubber trees, scattered throughout the dense jungle. They would have to collect the latex, coagulate it into balls, and then carry these heavy loads, sometimes 40 to 45 kilograms per person, through miles of jungle to Puerto Peruano, where the rubber would be transporting to La Chorrera. Many lived 25 to 30 miles away from the station, meaning their journey to deliver rubber could take days. The punishment for failing to meet quotas was death. Sometimes quick, sometimes slow, but always brutal. Those who tried to escape were hunted down with dogs and killed as examples to others. The testimony of witnesses would later reveal that O'Donnell, while perhaps not always pulling the trigger himself, ordered the deaths of over 500 indigenous people during his time at Entre Rios. Marshal Gorries, who had worked for the Peruvian Amazon Company, wrote in a 1907 letter to Benjamin Saldana Roca about O'Donnell's crimes. His words were chilling in their matter-of-fact tone. O'Donnell, who has not killed Indians with his own hands, but who has ordered over 500 Indians to be killed. This wasn't hearsay or rumor. This was testimony from someone who had been there, who had seen the bodies, who had watched as O'Donnell gave the orders. The year 1907 marked a turning point, though O'Donnell wouldn't have known it at the time. That was when Saldana Roca, a Peruvian journalist, began publishing articles in Iquitos newspapers about the atrocities in the Putumayo. His work, appearing in publications like La Sanción and La Felpa, began to lift the veil on what was happening in those remote rubber stations. The Peruvian Amazon Company and men like O'Donnell had operated in secrecy, protected by distance and the indifference of authorities. Now, slowly, the world was beginning to pay attention, but it would take more than newspaper articles to bring change. The real catalyst came in 1909 when two American engineers, Walter Hardenberg and W.B. Perkins, traveled through the Putumayo region. They had come to South America looking for work, traveling from Bogotá down into the Amazon basin. What they found instead was a nightmare. In January 1909, Hardenberg and Perkins were captured by agents of the Peruvian Amazon Company and held prisoner on a boat called the Liberal. During their captivity, they witnessed firsthand the treatment of indigenous workers, the whippings, the torture, the chains. Hardenberg would later write that he saw clear evidence of serious violations against the natives by the rubber tappers and their employees. When he was finally released and made his way to London, he brought with him a story that would shock the British public. Hardenberg's revelations, published in the British magazine Truth, caught the attention of humanitarian organizations and the British government. The Peruvian Amazon Company was registered in London, with British directors sitting on its board. Suddenly, what had seemed like distant colonial exploitation became a British scandal. The Anti-Slavery Society took up the cause, and pressure mounted for an official investigation. Enter Roger Casement, already famous for his investigation of atrocities in the Congo Free State, where he had exposed the brutal exploitation under King Leopold II of Belgium. Casement was the natural choice to investigate the Putumayo allegations. In 1910, he traveled to the Amazon as British Consul General, tasked with discovering the truth about what was happening at the rubber stations. Casement's investigation was thorough and devastating. He visited the rubber stations, including Entre Rios. He interviewed workers, both indigenous and the Barbadians who had been brought in by the company. He examined the instruments of torture, counted the scars on backs, and listened to story after story of murder, rape, and systematic brutality. When Casement arrived at Entre Rios, he found a scene of desolation. Traveling along the road to Puerto Peruano, he passed through what had once been the enormous clearings of the Iguarés Indians. His guide, Juan Tizon, told him they had once been very numerous. Hundreds of them had lived there. Now there were none at all. All is desolation, Casement wrote in his notes. The scale of death was almost incomprehensible. Entire peoples had been wiped out. The Pasay and Yuri peoples had vanished entirely, driven to extinction by the rubber trade. Other groups had been reduced to fragments of their former numbers. Where thousands had once lived, only dozens remained, and those survivors bore the physical and psychological scars of their ordeal. O'Donnell, when interviewed by Casement, tried to minimize his involvement. He claimed he only required moderate amounts of rubber from his workers, that conditions at Entre Rios were not as bad as at other stations. But the evidence contradicted him at every turn. 23 employees were stationed at Entre Rios under O'Donnell's command, and Casement noted this was the local force for controlling the life and limb of every Indian in the district. The testimonies collected by Casement painted a picture of systematic horror. Workers described being flogged until their backs were torn to pieces. Women told of being forced into sexual relationships with station managers and employees. Children spoke of watching their parents die in the stocks. And through it all, O'Donnell maintained his authority through terror, using the threat of death to extract every possible ounce of rubber from his captive workforce. One particularly horrific case involved a native woman named Sophia, according to testimony collected by Judge Carlos Valcárcel, who would conduct his own investigation in 1911. Sophia was executed on O'Donnell's orders because she had been unfaithful to her husband, Frederick Bishop, the same bishop who had revealed the true extent of rubber extraction at Entre Rios. The testimony stated that Sophia was both hanged and whipped by O'Donnell and Bishop until she died, her back torn to pieces by the lashing. A witness named Charuya Munane saw the killing, and Bishop buried her body on O'Donnell's orders. But Sophia's death was just one among hundreds. O'Donnell had also murdered a native captain named Papaya, and the motive was as cruel as the method. O'Donnell wanted Papaya's wife, Rosaura Witoto. There were multiple witnesses to this killing, including Santiago de Cal, who testified that O'Donnell had also tried to employ him as an executioner. Rosaura later became O'Donnell's mistress, though mistress seems too gentle a word for what was essentially sexual slavery. She told Judge Valcárcel that she had a daughter with O'Donnell named Teresa O'Donnell, who was in Lima at the time of her deposition. The personal nature of O'Donnell's crimes set him apart from some of the other station managers. While all participated in the system of exploitation, O'Donnell seemed to take a particular interest in the suffering he caused. Judge Valcárcel's report described how O'Donnell would lie in his hammock and shoot natives who were placed in a row in front of him. Around 40 men and women murdered in this casual, almost recreational manner. By 1910, O'Donnell had 3 children, all with different indigenous mothers. These children represented not just personal relationships, but the entire system of domination that the rubber barons had created. Indigenous women were property to be taken, used, and discarded. Their children might be acknowledged, as O'Donnell's were, but they occupied a liminal space. Neither fully part of the indigenous world their mothers came from nor fully accepted into the European world of their fathers. Casement's report, submitted to the British Foreign Secretary in January 1911, confirmed the worst allegations against the Peruvian Amazon Company and its agents. He wrote that the condition of things fully warrants the worst charges brought against the agents of the Peruvian Amazon Company and its methods on the Putumayo. The report was damning, but it was held back from publication for over a year while the British government gave Peru a chance to address the situation. Meanwhile, Judge Romulo Paredes conducted his own investigation for the Peruvian government. His work was even more extensive than Casement's, a 3,000-page manuscript documenting atrocities with physical evidence and eyewitness accounts. He issued 237 warrants for the arrest of those responsible for crimes in the Putumayo, including one for Andrés O'Donnell. But issuing warrants and actually arresting criminals in the Amazon were two very different things. Many of the accused fled as soon as word of the investigations reached them. They disappeared into the jungle, crossed borders into Colombia or Brazil, or made their way to the coastal cities where they could blend into the population or board ships for Europe or North America. O'Donnell, however, made a different choice. Instead of fleeing immediately, he appears to have stayed in the region for some time after Casement's visit. Perhaps he believed his connections would protect him, or perhaps he simply couldn't imagine that the system that had enriched him would turn against him. But by 1911, the pressure was mounting. Casement's report was creating waves in London, and the Peruvian government, embarrassed by the international attention, was being forced to act. It was then that O'Donnell made his escape, but he didn't disappear into the jungle or flee to some remote corner of South America. Instead, he went to Barbados, a British colony in the Caribbean. It was a curious choice. Why flee to a British territory when it was British pressure that had initiated the investigation? Perhaps O'Donnell believed that Barbados, far from the Amazon and with its own colonial administration, would be safe. Perhaps he had connections there through the Barbadian workers who had been employed by the Peruvian Amazon Company. Living comfortably in Barbados, O'Donnell might have thought he had escaped justice. But Roger Casement was not finished with him. In 1911, Casement discovered O'Donnell's whereabouts and tried to have him arrested. Casement would later note, with what seems like reluctant respect, that O'Donnell was the least criminal of the chief agents, and that "I don't think he killed Indians for pleasure or sport, but only to terrorize for rubber." It was a chilling distinction. O'Donnell was a pragmatic killer, not a sadistic one. His murders were business, not pleasure. An extradition order was issued by Peru, and O'Donnell was arrested in Barbados. For a moment, it seemed that justice might finally be served, but the extradition order was found to be faulty, some technical legal error that invalidated the whole process. O'Donnell was released, and before another order could be prepared, he had fled again. This time, O'Donnell went to Panama, and from there to the United States. His trail becomes harder to follow at this point. He had effectively disappeared, becoming one of the many fugitives from justice who simply vanished into the vastness of the Americas. Whether he lived under his own name or adopted a new identity, whether he prospered or lived in poverty, whether he ever felt remorse for his crimes, all of this is lost to history. The story of O'Donnell's escape was repeated across the Putumayo. Armando Normand, the station manager at Matanzas, who was described by Casement as one of the worst criminals in the region, was arrested in 1912, but escaped from prison in 1915 before facing trial. It was believed he fled to Brazil and changed his name. Augusto Jimenez, another station chief, was arrested but also escaped from jail. The pattern was consistent: arrest, escape, disappearance. Why were these men able to escape so easily? Part of the answer lies in the corruption and inefficiency of the colonial justice system. Prisons in the Amazon were not secure facilities, but often just buildings with guards who could be bribed or intimidated. The vast distances and poor communications made it easy for fugitives to disappear. And perhaps most importantly, there were many people with an interest in seeing these men escape, others who had profited from the rubber trade and feared what captured criminals might reveal. But there was another factor at work, one that speaks to the fundamental nature of colonial exploitation. The Peruvian Amazon Company and its agents were part of a global system that valued profit over human life. The rubber they extracted fed the industries of Europe and North America. The money they generated flowed through banks in London, New York, and Paris. Even as the atrocities were exposed, even as public opinion turned against them, the underlying system remained intact. The company itself provides a telling example. After Casement's report was published in 1912, the Peruvian Amazon Company went into liquidation. But this was a financial reorganization, not a moral reckoning. The directors, those British gentlemen who had profited from the suffering in the Putumayo while never setting foot in the Amazon, faced no criminal charges. The Select Committee of the British Parliament that investigated the matter concluded that the directors cannot escape their share of the collective moral responsibility. But moral responsibility, it seemed, carried no legal consequences. Julio Cesar Arana, the Peruvian who had built the rubber empire in the Putumayo, also escaped justice. Despite being named directly in multiple investigations as responsible for the atrocities, he was never prosecuted. He continued to live comfortably, his wealth intact, his reputation damaged, but his freedom assured. The indigenous peoples he had enslaved and murdered had no such protection. The end of the rubber boom came not from moral outrage, but from economic change. Rubber seeds smuggled out of the Amazon had been successfully planted in Asian colonies, particularly in British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. These plantations could produce rubber more efficiently and cheaply than the wild rubber collection in the Amazon. By 1913, Asian rubber was flooding the market, and the price of Amazonian rubber collapsed. The stations in the Putumayo were abandoned almost overnight. What happened to the indigenous peoples who survived? The Witoto, who had numbered in the tens of thousands before the rubber boom, were reduced to a few thousand. The Andok were nearly extinct. The Bora and Okena had lost most of their population. Those who remained carried not just the physical scars of their ordeal, but the cultural trauma of seeing their entire world destroyed. Some survivors told their stories to anthropologists and historians in later years. Their accounts, filtered through translation and time, provide glimpses of the horror they endured. They speak of family members killed for failing to meet rubber quotas, of children murdered in front of their parents, of women raped and discarded, of men worked to death and left unburied in the forest. But they also speak of resistance. Not all indigenous people submitted passively to their enslavement. There were escapes, rebellions, and acts of sabotage. Some groups fled deeper into the forest, abandoning their traditional territories to escape the rubber gatherers. Others fought back. In 1909, Carlos Scharf, another rubber baron operating in the region, was killed by his own indigenous workers in a coordinated uprising. The mutiny was sparked by the constant abuse and sexual violence against indigenous women, and resulted in the death of Scharf and 10 of his employees. The story of resistance is important because it challenges the narrative of indigenous peoples as passive victims. They were victims, certainly, subjected to horrors that defy comprehension. But they were also agents of their own survival, fighting back when they could, fleeing when they couldn't fight, and maintaining their cultural identity despite efforts to destroy it. The Catholic Church, which had a presence in the region through various missions, presents a complicated part of this story. Some missionaries tried to protect indigenous peoples from the worst abuses, providing sanctuary and advocating on their behalf. But the church was also part of the colonial system, often working hand in hand with the rubber companies to civilize the indigenous population. The line between protection and exploitation was not always clear. International humanitarian organizations played a crucial role in exposing the atrocities. The Anti-Slavery Society in London was particularly active, using Casement's report and Hardenberg's testimony to maintain public pressure for action. Their work helped create the international outcry that forced investigations and ultimately the collapse of the Peruvian Amazon Company. But even as the company collapsed and the rubber barons fled, the underlying injustices remained. The land that had been stolen was not returned. The peoples who had been enslaved received no compensation. The dead were not honored or even counted. The transformation of the Amazon from indigenous homeland to extractive frontier continued, just with different commodities and different methods. O'Donnell's disappearance into the United States is particularly symbolic. America in the early 20th century was experiencing its own rapid industrialization, its own expansion into frontier territories, its own complicated relationship with indigenous peoples. O'Donnell, if he lived under an assumed name, might have found work in any number of industries. He might have become a respectable citizen, his past buried and forgotten. The United States had its own rubber interests in the Amazon. American companies and investors were deeply involved in the rubber trade, and American demand for rubber products helped drive the boom. Henry Ford would later attempt to create his own rubber plantation in the Brazilian Amazon, Fordlandia, which failed spectacularly but showed the continued American interest in Amazonian resources. We don't know what happened to O'Donnell after he reached the United States. Did he live in fear of discovery? Did he ever think about the hundreds of people who died on his orders? Did he justify his actions to himself as necessary for progress, for civilization, for profit? Or did he simply forget, moving on to a new life as if the old one had never existed? The children he left behind provide one of the few continuing links to his story. Teresa O'Donnell, his daughter with Rosaura Witoto, was in Lima in 1911. What became of her? Did she know who her father was, what he had done? Did she carry his name as a burden or wear it without knowledge of its weight? The other two children, also with indigenous mothers, disappeared from the historical record. They were living reminders of the sexual exploitation that accompanied the economic exploitation of the rubber boom. The documentation of O'Donnell's crimes comes from multiple sources, each with its own perspective and limitations. Marshall Gorries, who first exposed O'Donnell in 1907, was himself part of the system, a former employee of the Peruvian Amazon Company. His testimony carries the weight of an insider's knowledge, but also the complications of someone who was, at least for a time, complicit in the system he later exposed. Roger Casement's investigation was thorough and professional, but he was also an outsider, viewing the situation through the lens of British humanitarian concern. His later execution for treason by the British government. He was hanged in 1916 for his role in seeking German support for Irish independence, added another layer of complexity to his legacy. Some defenders of the rubber companies tried to use his conviction to discredit his earlier humanitarian work, though unsuccessfully. Judge Carlos Valcárcel's investigation was perhaps the most comprehensive, collecting over 3,000 pages of testimony and evidence. But even his work was limited by the realities of investigating crimes in the remote Amazon, where witnesses could disappear, evidence could be destroyed, and powerful interests worked against the truth being revealed. The Barbadian workers who testified about conditions at the rubber stations occupied a unique position. Men like Frederick Bishop, who worked at Entre Rios under O'Donnell, were both witnesses to atrocities and participants in the system of exploitation. They had been brought to the Amazon with promises of good wages, but found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Their testimony was crucial in exposing the crimes, but it also revealed the complicated hierarchies of colonial exploitation. They were above the indigenous workers, but below the European and Peruvian managers, both oppressed and oppressor. The British Parliamentary Select Committee that investigated the Peruvian Amazon Company after Casement's report provides another perspective on the case. The Peruvian government's response to the scandal was marked by initial denial, reluctant investigation, and ultimately ineffective prosecution. The 237 warrants issued by Judge Pairds looked impressive on paper, but few led to actual arrests, and fewer still to convictions. The escape of criminals like O'Donnell and Normand showed either incompetence or complicity, probably both, in the justice system. The indigenous testimonies collected during the various investigations are perhaps the most powerful and most problematic sources. Powerful because they provide direct accounts of suffering and resistance. Problematic because they were filtered through translators, recorded by officials who might not have understood cultural contexts, and given in circumstances of extreme power imbalance. How many chose not to testify out of fear? How many testimonies were lost, ignored, or suppressed? The role of the media in exposing the Putumayo atrocities cannot be understated. Benjamin Saldana Roca's articles in La Sanción and La Felpa in 1907 began the process of exposure. Walter Hardenberg's publications in Truth magazine brought the story to British attention. The international press coverage that followed Casement's report created the public pressure that forced action, however limited. But the media also had its limitations. Sensationalism sometimes overshadowed substance. The focus on the most extreme atrocities sometimes obscured the systematic nature of the exploitation. And once the immediate scandal passed, media attention moved on to other stories, leaving the underlying issues unresolved. The economic context of the rubber boom is crucial to understanding how men like O'Donnell could commit such crimes with impunity for so long. The global demand for rubber had created a gold rush mentality in the Amazon. Prices were high, profits were enormous, and in the remote jungle, far from the constraints of law and civilization, anything seemed permissible. The automobile industry, just beginning its explosive growth, demanded ever more rubber for tires. Electrical industries needed rubber for insulation. Military applications required rubber for various equipment. The industrial nations of Europe and North America had an insatiable appetite for this natural resource, and they were willing to overlook how it was obtained as long as it kept flowing. The financial structures that supported the rubber trade were complex and international. The Peruvian Amazon Company was registered in London but operated in Peru. It raised capital from British investors, sold rubber to American companies, and used banking services that spanned the globe. This complexity made it difficult to assign responsibility when the atrocities were exposed. Who was to blame? The station managers who ordered the killings, the company directors who set the quotas, the investors who demanded returns, or the consumers who bought the products. The transformation of the Putumayo region during the rubber boom was total. What had been indigenous territory, organized according to traditional patterns of settlement and cultivation, became an industrial extraction zone. Rivers that had been transportation routes for canoes became highways for steamships carrying rubber. Forest paths became roads for forced marches of enslaved workers. Sacred sites became killing grounds. The demographic catastrophe was unprecedented in the region's history. Populations that had survived centuries of colonial contact were wiped out in a matter of years. Languages disappeared as their last speakers died. Cultural practices, accumulated knowledge about the forest, spiritual traditions, all were lost in the carnage. Yet even in the midst of this destruction, there were moments of humanity. Roger Casement wrote about indigenous people who helped him during his investigation, risking their lives to provide testimony. There were company employees who tried to minimize the suffering where they could, who treated indigenous workers with some degree of dignity despite the system they were part of. There were missionaries who provided sanctuary, traders who refused to participate in the worst abuses, and officials who tried to enforce some semblance of law. These moments don't excuse or diminish the horror of what happened, but they remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, individual choices matter. O'Donnell chose to order the deaths of hundreds. Others chose differently. The system of exploitation created the context for atrocity, but individuals made the decision to participate or resist. The comparison with other zones of extraction in the Amazon is instructive. The Putumayo was not unique. Similar atrocities occurred wherever rubber was gathered using forced labor. Carlos Schaaf's operations, Nicolás Suárez's Bolivian Empire, the various Brazilian seringais, all featured similar patterns of exploitation and violence. What made the Putumayo special was not the scale of the atrocities, but the fact that they were exposed and documented. The role of national borders in the story is significant. The Putumayo region was disputed territory, claimed by both Peru and Colombia. This jurisdictional confusion provided cover for the rubber companies, who could play one government against the other. When Colombian authorities tried to investigate abuses, Peruvian forces would intervene. When Peru faced international pressure, they could blame Colombian insurgents for violence in the region. O'Donnell and others exploited these border disputes. When threatened with arrest by one country, they could flee to another. The lack of extradition treaties, the weak governmental presence in frontier regions, and the corruption of local officials all combined to create a zone of impunity where criminals could operate freely. The question of what motivated men like O'Donnell remains troubling. Was it simple greed? The commissions on rubber were substantial. O'Donnell was owed £1,800 by the company in 1910, with another £300 expected, substantial sums for the time. But money alone doesn't explain the cruelty, the systematic dehumanization, the apparent pleasure some took in causing suffering. Perhaps it was the corrupting nature of absolute power. In the isolation of the jungle, with complete control over life and death, men like O'Donnell became gods in their own minds. The normal constraints of civilization, law, social pressure, moral teaching, didn't apply. They could do whatever they wanted, and what they wanted was to extract the maximum amount of rubber regardless of human cost. Or perhaps it was something about the colonial mindset itself, the belief that indigenous peoples were less than human, that their suffering didn't matter, that they existed only to serve the needs of civilization. This dehumanization was not unique to the Amazon or to the rubber trade. It was the foundation of colonial exploitation worldwide. The parallels with other historical atrocities are unavoidable. The systematic nature of the killing, the industrial efficiency of the exploitation, the bureaucratic structure that enabled and obscured the violence, all of this prefigures later genocides. The Putumayo genocide, as it's now known, was not an aberration, but part of a pattern that would be repeated throughout the 20th century. The legal aftermath of the Putumayo revelations was deeply unsatisfying. Despite the overwhelming evidence, despite the international outcry, despite the official investigations, almost no one was punished for the crimes. O'Donnell escaped to the United States. Normand escaped from prison. Arana continued his business activities. The company directors faced no prosecution. Justice, in any meaningful sense, was not served. This failure of justice had profound implications. It sent a message that crimes against indigenous peoples would not be punished, that international humanitarian law had no teeth, that profit trumped human rights. It established precedents that would echo through the century. From the Amazon to the Congo, from corporate exploitation to state-sponsored genocide, the pattern of impunity continued. The environmental destruction that accompanied the human catastrophe is often overlooked. The rubber boom didn't just kill people, it transformed landscapes. Vast areas of forest were cleared for easier access to rubber trees. Traditional agricultural areas were abandoned as indigenous peoples were forced into rubber collection. The delicate ecological balance that indigenous communities had maintained for generations was shattered. Rivers were polluted with the chemicals used to process rubber. Wildlife was hunted to extinction to feed the rubber stations. The noise and violence of the extraction process drove away animals that indigenous peoples had traditionally relied on for protein. The forest itself became a place of terror, its paths marked by the bodies of those who had tried to escape. The cultural destruction was equally profound. Indigenous knowledge systems, accumulated over millennia, were lost as elders died and young people were prevented from learning traditional skills. Languages disappeared not just because their speakers died, but because children were forbidden to speak them at the rubber stations. Spiritual practices were suppressed, sacred sites were desecrated, and the complex social structures that had organized indigenous life were deliberately destroyed. The rubber boom created a new social order in the Amazon, one based entirely on the extraction of natural resources for distant markets. This order survived the collapse of the rubber trade and continues in different forms today, through logging, mining, cattle ranching, and industrial agriculture. The methods may be less overtly violent, but the fundamental relationship between extraction and exploitation remains. O'Donnell's escape to the United States and subsequent disappearance raises questions about American complicity in the rubber atrocities. The United States was one of the largest consumers of Amazon rubber. American companies and investors were involved in the trade. Yet when criminals like O'Donnell fled to America, there seems to have been no effort to arrest or extradite them. Was this simple ignorance? Did American authorities not know who O'Donnell was? Or was it calculated indifference? A decision that pursuing fugitive rubber barons was not worth the diplomatic and economic complications it might cause? Or was it something more sinister, active protection of men who had served the interests of American capital, even through criminal means? The story of the Barbadian workers adds another dimension to the narrative. These men, brought from the Caribbean to work in the Amazon, found themselves in an impossible position. They were promised good wages and decent conditions. Instead, they found themselves witnesses to, and sometimes participants in, atrocities. Their testimony was crucial in exposing the crimes, but their own role remains ambiguous. Some, like Frederick Bishop, clearly participated in violence against indigenous workers. The testimony about Sophia's murder makes this clear. Others tried to maintain some distance from the worst abuses. All were trapped in a system that made them both victims and oppressors, exploited by the company, but positioned above indigenous workers in the racial hierarchy of the rubber stations. The question of resistance deserves more attention than it usually receives in accounts of the rubber boom. Indigenous peoples did not submit passively to their exploitation. They fled into the forest, they sabotaged rubber collection, they killed their oppressors when they could. The murder of Carlos Scharf and his employees in 1909 was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of resistance that the rubber companies tried to suppress. But resistance came at a terrible cost. For every successful escape, many were hunted down and killed. For every act of sabotage, collective punishments were imposed. For every oppressor killed, reprisals were taken against entire communities. The mathematics of resistance were brutal. The rubber companies had guns, dogs, and the backing of state power. Indigenous peoples had only their knowledge of the forest and their determination to survive. The role of women in this story is often overlooked, but crucial. Indigenous women faced not just forced labor, but systematic sexual violence. They were taken as wives by station managers, forced to bear children who would grow up between two worlds. They watched their husbands and children murdered, their communities destroyed. Yet they also preserved cultural knowledge, maintained family bonds despite separation, and sometimes found ways to protect their children from the worst abuses. Rosora Witoto's story is emblematic. After O'Donnell murdered her husband to take her as his mistress, she bore him a daughter. She survived to testify about her experience, providing crucial evidence about O'Donnell's crimes. But what happened to her after her testimony? How did she rebuild her life after such trauma? These questions remain unanswered, her story incomplete like so many others from this period. The children of these forced unions occupied a liminal space in Amazonian society, not fully accepted by either indigenous communities or European society. They were living reminders of the violence that created them. Some, like Teresa O'Donnell, were sent away for education, separated from their mothers and their indigenous heritage. Others remained in the Amazon, their mixed heritage both a burden and sometimes a slight protection in the harsh racial hierarchies of the frontier. The psychological impact of the rubber boom on survivors is impossible to fully comprehend. Post-traumatic stress, though not named as such at the time, must have been universal among survivors. The constant fear, the witnessed atrocities, the loss of family and community, the destruction of everything familiar, all of this created wounds that could never fully heal. Oral histories collected from indigenous communities decades after the rubber boom ended reveal the lasting trauma. Stories of the rubber time are still told, passed down through generations as warnings and as remembrance. The mythologization of events, like the stories of the Tigre Negro that Leonardo Tello heard from his father, shows how communities process trauma through narrative, transforming historical events into cautionary tales. The economic collapse of the rubber boom happened with stunning speed. In 1910, Amazonian rubber dominated the world market. By 1913, Asian plantation rubber had taken over. The stations that had been sites of such suffering were abandoned almost overnight. The infrastructure of exploitation, the buildings, the roads, the equipment, was left to rot in the jungle. O'Donnell, if he was following events from his hiding place in the United States, would have watched this collapse with what emotions? Relief that the investigations would likely end with the industry itself, regret for lost profits, or indifference, having already moved on to whatever new life he had created for himself. The abandoned rubber stations became ghost towns in the jungle, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Indigenous survivors sometimes returned to their traditional territories, finding them transformed and depopulated. The process of rebuilding communities, cultures, and populations would take generations, and in some cases would never be completed. The Peruvian government's handling of the aftermath was characterized by denial and deflection. Officials blamed foreign companies, claimed the atrocities were exaggerated, and suggested that indigenous peoples were prone to fabrication. When forced to act by international pressure, they made a show of investigations and arrests, but allowed the perpetrators to escape. The pattern of impunity established during the rubber boom continued. Colombia's role in the story is complex. As the other claimant to the Putumayo territory, Colombia had protested the abuses committed by Peruvian rubber companies. But Colombian rubber gatherers were also operating in the region, and there's no evidence they were significantly less brutal than their Peruvian counterparts. The nationalization of the conflict, making it about Peruvian versus Colombian sovereignty rather than about human rights, obscured the real issues. Brazil, the third nation with interests in the region, maintained a studied neutrality that was effectively complicity. Brazilian territory provided refuge for fleeing criminals. Brazilian rivers carried rubber to market regardless of how it was obtained. Brazilian authorities showed little interest in investigating crimes that didn't directly affect Brazilian citizens. The international humanitarian movement that had exposed the Putumayo atrocities moved on to other causes after the collapse of the rubber boom. The Anti-Slavery Society continued its work, but the Amazon faded from international attention. The indigenous peoples who had suffered so terribly were left to rebuild without international support or oversight. World War I, beginning in 1914, shifted international attention entirely. The European powers that had expressed such outrage about the Putumayo were soon engaged in their own industrial-scale killing. Roger Casement, the humanitarian hero who had exposed the atrocities, was executed by the British government in 1916. The rubber from the Amazon, no longer commercially viable for most uses, found new life in military applications. The United States, where O'Donnell had fled, was experiencing its own period of rapid industrialization and expansion. If O'Donnell had assumed a new identity and found work, he would have been part of the American economic boom of the 1910s and 1920s. Perhaps he worked in industry, using skills learned in the Amazon. Perhaps he went into business, applying the ruthless lessons of the rubber trade to new ventures. We can imagine him reading newspapers about the Amazon, if he dared. The occasional article about former rubber territories now being explored for other resources. The obituaries of other rubber barons, some dying wealthy and respected despite their crimes. The slow forgetting of what had happened in the Putumayo as new atrocities commanded public attention. Did O'Donnell ever return to South America? It seems unlikely, but not impossible. By the 1920s, with the rubber boom a fading memory and many of the witnesses dead, he might have felt safe enough to visit under an assumed name. Several former rubber barons did return, reinventing themselves as respectable businessmen or landowners. The archives are full of suspicious gaps, unnamed investors, and mysterious figures who appeared with capital and no clear history. The descendants of O'Donnell's victims, meanwhile, were struggling to survive and rebuild. The demographic catastrophe of the rubber boom had long-lasting effects. Smaller populations meant less ability to defend traditional territories. Loss of elders meant loss of cultural knowledge. The trauma of the rubber period created social problems that persisted for generations. Some indigenous groups chose isolation, retreating deeper into the forest to avoid all contact with outsiders. These uncontacted peoples, as they're now known, made a rational decision based on their experience. Contact with the outside world brought only death and suffering. Their isolation continues today, a direct result of the trauma inflicted during the rubber boom. Other groups tried to adapt to the new reality, learning Spanish or Portuguese, converting to Christianity, seeking education and integration into national society. But they faced discrimination, poverty, and continued exploitation. The racial hierarchies established during the colonial period and reinforced during the rubber boom persisted. The legal precedents set by the failure to prosecute the Putumayo crimes had lasting consequences. Throughout the 20th century, crimes against indigenous peoples in the Amazon continued to go unpunished. Land invasions, forced displacement, cultural destruction, all continued with minimal legal consequences for the perpetrators. The message sent by O'Donnell's escape was clear. Indigenous lives didn't matter to the justice system. The environmental exploitation that characterized the rubber boom also continued in new forms. Logging, mining, oil extraction, industrial agriculture. Each brought its own forms of environmental destruction and human rights abuses. The model established during the rubber boom, external demand driving resource extraction regardless of local consequences, persisted. Modern investigations into the rubber boom period have uncovered new evidence about the scale and nature of the atrocities. Archaeological work at former rubber stations has found evidence of mass grave. Analysis of demographic data has revealed the full extent of population loss. Oral history projects have recorded survivor testimonies before they're lost forever, but much remains unknown. The fate of many perpetrators, including O'Donnell after he reached the United States, is uncertain. The full extent of the killing may never be known. Many deaths were never recorded, many communities disappeared without trace. The cultural and linguistic loss is incalculable and irreversible. The question of justice remains unresolved. There have been calls for posthumous trials, for official recognition of the genocide, for reparations to descendant communities. But these calls have largely gone unheeded. The Putumayo genocide remains a historical footnote, known to specialists but ignored by the broader public. O'Donnell's story raises uncomfortable questions about complicity and justice that remain relevant today. How do we assign responsibility for systematic atrocities? What obligation do consumer nations have for crimes committed in their supply chains? How do we achieve justice when perpetrators have power and victims are marginalized? These questions, first raised by the Putumayo revelations, continue to challenge us. The modern Amazon faces new threats that echo the rubber boom period. Deforestation, climate change, and continued exploitation of indigenous peoples create contemporary parallels to the historical tragedy. The lessons of the rubber boom, the danger of unregulated extraction, the vulnerability of indigenous peoples, the importance of international oversight, seem not to have been learned. Some indigenous communities have achieved recognition and protection for their territories, using international law and advocacy to defend their rights. But others continue to face invasion, violence, and exploitation. The struggle that began during the rubber boom continues, with indigenous peoples fighting for survival and recognition in a world that still values their resources more than their lives. The story of Andres O'Donnell and the Putumayo genocide is not just historical. It's a warning about what happens when profit is valued over people, when distance obscures suffering, when justice is denied. O'Donnell's escape represents not just one man avoiding punishment, but a system protecting itself from accountability. As we near the end of this account, it's worth considering what justice might have looked like. If O'Donnell had been captured, tried, and convicted, would it have changed anything? Would it have brought back the dead, restored the destroyed cultures, healed the trauma? Perhaps not. But it would have established that even in the remote Amazon, even against marginalized peoples, there were limits to what could be done in the name of profit. Instead, O'Donnell's disappearance became part of the larger disappearance of peoples, cultures, languages, and ultimately of responsibility. The rubber barons vanished into history, their fortunes intact, their crimes unpunished. The companies dissolved and reformed under new names. The consumers of rubber products never knew or quickly forgot where their commodities came from and at what cost. But the indigenous peoples of the Amazon remember. In their oral histories, in their continued struggle for rights and recognition, in their insistence on surviving despite centuries of attempts to eliminate them, they keep the memory alive. The story of the rubber boom is not finished. It continues in every fight for indigenous territory, in every protest against extraction, in every demand for justice. O'Donnell, if he lived to old age in the United States, would have died sometime in the mid-20th century. Perhaps he had a family who never knew his real identity. Perhaps he built a successful business, contributed to his community, was remembered as a respectable citizen.